The alarm had been shrieking for 6 seconds before I understood what I was looking at. My whole body had seized. Every muscle, every joint, every crystalline ridge running down my forearms had gone rigid in the same ancient paralysis my species had never managed to shed. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I could only watch, frozen, as Kessad hoisted Desessie into the air by her throat, her small legs kicking uselessly, while Professor Torvon backed into the display board with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that meant nothing at all to a Dratha who had already decided the room was his. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To explain what happened that day in a classroom on Palio 7, I have to start with her. My name is Relic Savv. I'm Veilani, tall, thin, and fragile in ways that make most other species in the Concord either pity me or ignore me outright. My bones are hollow, threaded with mineral deposits that give my skin a faint crystalline shimmer. Beautiful, people tell me, also about as sturdy as wet glass. I'd enrolled at the Concord Institute on Palio 7 hoping for a career in the diplomatic corps, the most prestigious multi-species academy in 3 sectors. I wasn't the smartest student there or the bravest. I was the kind who sat in the middle row, took careful notes, and tried never to be noticed by anything with claws. The institute drew students from 42 recognized species. Armored, reptilian Dratha who treated corridors like furniture they hadn't decided to break yet. The clicking, precise chiver. The Meluri gliding through the halls in sealed hover tanks of their homeworld's alkaline sea. We were told constantly that this was a place of learning and civility. Then, at the start of my 2nd year, they admitted the human. Her name was Marin Ortega. She arrived on a supply shuttle with a single travel bag and a notebook made of actual paper, which half the student body mistook for some kind of cultural relic. Earth had only just 1 probationary Concord membership, and most people assumed her admission was a political gesture, not an academic one. Humans were pre-integration, from a Category 12 death world, which sounded impressive until you looked at one and realized it had no claws, no venom, no armor, nothing. Marin was shorter than almost everyone on campus. She smiled at strangers, asked too many questions in the dining hall about which foods would kill her versus merely make her sick, and seemed to find the distinction genuinely funny. She sat in the back row, doodled with a little wooden pencil, and was, by every metric I could name, the least remarkable person on the station. We ended up in the same seminar, Professor Torvon's class on interspecies conflict resolution. She mangled my species name 3 times in our first conversation and apologized so earnestly each time that I finally told her to stop trying, just to end the ordeal. Most students didn't bother forming an opinion of her at all. The Dratha ignored her completely. The Chiver studied her the way an entomologist studies a new bug. I overheard a cluster of varsity upperclassmen dismiss her admission as the academic equivalent of bringing a pet to a conference. A nice gesture, contributing nothing real. Marin was close enough to hear it. She didn't react. She just kept eating. The real trouble started with Kessad. Kessad was a 3rd-year Dratha from a military caste family. 3 meters of interlocking natural armor and 3 rows of bone-crushing teeth. He hadn't come to the institute out of any interest in diplomacy. His family wanted it on his record. He moved through the campus like a weather system everyone had learned to track and avoid, flanked always by 2 companions, Breck and Tessif, nearly as large and just as hostile. Kessad called the smaller species prey animals. He talked about glass bones and soft skin the way other people talk about the weather, and nobody stopped him because the Dratha delegation had made it very clear their students were to be handled with cultural sensitivity, which apparently meant total immunity. On her 3rd day, Marin sat down at Kessad's usual table without knowing it was his. When he loomed over her, crest flared. She held up a small piece of chocolate and offered to share it. He crushed it in his fist and let the crumbs fall onto her tray, then walked off without a word. Marin looked at the ruin, shrugged, and went back to eating like nothing had happened. I remember thinking she was either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. Mostly, though, I remember thinking she looked small, not just physically, but in the way something looks small when it hasn't yet grasped the size of what surrounds it. The weeks that followed had a rhythm, if you didn't look too closely at the cracks underneath. Marin and I developed a cautious friendship. She borrowed my notes. I asked her too many questions about Earth that I told myself were purely academic. What I learned unsettled me. She functioned on 4 hours of sleep. A cut on her hand healed to a faint pink line within a week, something a Meluri classmate called unremarkable for a Death World species. While I quietly did the math on how long the same wound would take to close on me, she ate things that were mildly toxic to 3 other species and called it flavor. She also started watching things. Not the way most students drifted through the halls, but with the same cataloging focus the Chiver used to file information. She watched the hierarchies. She watched how conversations died when Kessad passed. Late nights in the library, I caught her scrolling through anatomical databases Dratha once, before she switched screens without a word. Neither of us mentioned it. Meanwhile, Kessad kept escalating, as if testing exactly how far his immunity stretched. He locked a Chiver student into a defensive curl that took the medics 3 hours to undo. He cracked a Meluri student's hover tank in a corridor, nearly killing him before the leak was sealed. Reports were filed and buried every time, the Dratha delegation issuing statements about cultural misunderstanding that the administration accepted without argument. 3 days after Marin asked me, quietly, whether anyone had ever actually stood up to him, Kessad cornered me in an empty corridor and shoved me into the wall hard enough to crack a ridge on my forearm. He told me to keep quiet. Then he left, and I stood frozen against that wall for 11 minutes before my body let me move again. Marin found me on the floor. She said nothing, the answer was obvious, just walked me to the medical bay and sat with me in a silence that felt loaded, like something enormous was being held very carefully in place. That night, she filed a formal complaint on my behalf, citing 4 separate incidents. It was rejected within the hour. Insufficient evidence. I heard she sat alone in the commons afterward, completely still, staring at the rejection glowing on her datapad. Humans have a phrase for that look. I'd learn later. The calm before the storm. It happened on a Tuesday in the same seminar room during a lecture on de-escalation. Torvon made the mistake of referencing recent tensions within this institution, vague enough to seem safe. Kessad didn't think so. He stood so fast his desk screeched sideways, crest flaring to twice its size, releasing the pheromone wave that drops every prey-evolved species in the room into paralysis. I felt my ridges lock. Torvon hit the wall, hands raised, unable to speak. Kessad's companions sealed both exits. Then he grabbed Desessie, barely a meter tall, by the throat and lifted her off the ground. I wanted to move, couldn't. It wasn't a choice. It was biology. And then, in the back row, Marin stood up. Slowly, she closed her notebook, set down her pencil, and walked toward the front of the room, through the pheromone cloud that had frozen every other body present, without so much as a flinch. I'd learn later that humans simply lack the receptors those chemicals are built to hit. Passed through her like light through glass. She stopped 3 meters from Kessad and said, "Put her down." Calm, conversational, like she was asking someone to pass a plate. He laughed and threw Desessie aside instead. Then he turned on Marin. What followed lasted 63 seconds by the timestamp, though it felt outside of time altogether. She used his own momentum against him, targeted the gaps in his plating, the joints, points no public anatomy file described. She'd studied him, studied all of them, quietly in the back row, for months. One companion tackled her into the lectern. She came up bleeding and only moved faster. By the end, all 3 Dratha were on the floor, and Marin was kneeling beside Desessie, checking her breathing with the same hands that had just put 3 predators down. When security arrived, she was sitting on the floor, blood drying on her face, the Pelori's hand in hers. The 3 of them assaulted a student, she told the officer. I intervened. I'd like to file a report. The disciplinary hearing that followed was its own kind of battle. Documentation, charter provisions, security footage played in total silence. And Marin won it on evidence alone, calmly dismantling the ambassador's theory that she must be some kind of hidden operative. She was expelled from nothing. Kessad and his companions were expelled from everything. What changed afterward wasn't loud. The commons stopped sorting itself by species. Students who'd spent years pressed against the walls started sitting in the middle of rooms. I got my placement into the diplomatic corps not for the reasons I expected, but because something in how I saw the galaxy had shifted, because I'd watched a girl who was afraid the entire time refused to sit down anyway. On the last day of term, I found her at the observation deck, Desessie pressed against her hip, newly bonded as her life guardian. Marin handed me a page torn from her notebook, a pencil drawing of the commons as it had become, a dozen species sharing one table. "This is what I came here to find," she said. "I still have that drawing. It hangs in my office, 12 years later, and when visitors ask about it, I tell them the truth. It was drawn by a human, on a scrap of a dead tree, showing a future the rest of us hadn't yet earned the courage to imagine. Then, if they have time, I tell them about the exchange student who closed her notebook and stood up. They always have time. Everyone does.